This is part 6 of this long presentation. And I think it's now time to just mention 2 proverbs, 2 Yoruba proverbs. One is Ọmọdé gbọ́n, àgbà gbọ́n, la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀. And roughly translated to English, it's the wisdom of youth and adults was instrumental to laying the foundation and building of Ilé Ifẹ̀, which is considered the spiritual home of the Yorubas. This means that when the younger generation loudly proclaim that it is important and necessary and imperative to sọ̀rọ̀ sókè, everybody needs to listen. It's wisdom, because there's also a Yoruba saying that says, "Ẹni bá dákẹ́, tààrẹ̀ á bá dákẹ́." If you remain silent, your problems will remain unsolved. So it is very important to speak out when one is being oppressed. It is important to speak truth to power. It is important to loudly proclaim in the face of powerful interests that don't care whether you live or die, that I am here, that I know I am oppressed, and I reject my oppression. This is what the young people are doing. And what they're doing, seen within the context of Yoruba worldview, is very important. And it is also part of democracy, that when people are experiencing marginalization and oppression and brutality, they should speak, they should organize, they should protest. Democratic protest, which is peaceful and organized and expressive, is sacrosanct in all meaningful democracies. So the young people are doing the right thing. Now let's get to the conclusion. The conclusion here is that Africans, including the youth, engage in constitutive acts that shape political, economic, and social relations. Using the tools and mechanisms provided, they engage in actions that shape political, economic, and social relations in ways that could only be imagined before the availability of the cutting-edge communication tools provided during the contemporary age of globalization. Structural conditions shape dialectical relationships of social, economic, and political constructs, institutions, and relationships. African transnational communities in motion are showing us the limits and infinite possibilities of many of our social, economic, and political constructs and institutions and relationships and their dialectic relationships. So you see, we see connections between the Africans in the diaspora and the young protesters in Nigeria who were doing the Sọ̀rọ̀ Sókè protests. Flutterwave was devised, established by Nigerians in the diaspora. And it became a useful tool for collecting funds that helped the protesters to do the logistics and all that they needed to do in organizing the protests until it was shut down by the Nigerian government. So we also see these things that are happening as enriching conceptual understandings of transnationalism, globalism, democracy, citizenship, and identity. These activities in cyberspace also enrich our understandings of what is happening in a rapidly changing global system. Now, were the Sorosoke protests a radical resistance? I contend that this is only so to the extent that it was more inclusive of otherwise marginalized and muzzled voices, for example, the queer community. It was unquestionably a generational struggle for justice and true democracy, though. But the more connected, more plugged into the global arena, more media savvy of the protesters were more visible, vocal, and present in those protests. Nonetheless, the voice of discontented youth was projected in a collective demand for an end to police brutality, human rights abuses, official impunity, and undemocratic praxis. The youth were asking questions, engaging struggle in their own ways. They were using new modes of organizing that acted spontaneously and somewhat sporadically. Those with a stake in the system engaged in peaceful protests. Those more marginalized were violent. State response to both groups was the same: violent repression that killed 15 at Lekki Toll Bridge and many others throughout Nigeria. The short-lived existence of the protests also tells us about the nature of neoliberal globalism and the ease with which these struggles can be co-opted. The moment in which the protests emerged is important. The George Floyd killing by the police in the United States evoked a powerful response in which the Black Lives Matter movement protested effectively to condemn historical and contemporary police brutality, white supremacy, discrimination, and injustice in the United States of America. This was a moment of racial reckoning in the US, and Black Lives Matter rose to the challenge. The ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic and the clear racial disparities in infections, access to treatment, and fatalities also evoked protests. The Black Lives Matter mantra became universalized. For the #EndSARS protesters in Nigeria and her diaspora, it is hypocritical to assert that Black Lives Matter in the US and not to do so, and not to do likewise in Africa and Nigeria. So they were calling out Nigerians and Africans and saying, if Black Lives Matter in the US, they do matter in Nigeria and in Africa as well. Other parts of the global South also embraced the struggle against state repression in all its ramifications. It is clear that cyberspace communications and communities are not identical with face-to-face ones. Many people have expressed Zoom fatigue, and there's evidence of malevolent cyberbullying being documented. And also there is currently the capacity to manipulate images and use information in ways that deceive, that terrorize, and perpetrate fraud. Africans will definitely continue using the available tools that continue to be improved upon. Increasingly, we are also seeing Africans creating some, as is evident in tech hubs in places like Nairobi, Lagos, Cape Town, Cairo, Accra, and urban centers in the continent. Metaverse is an emergent form of cyber world that would further shape human communications and relations in ways that raise more questions, including government interference, affordability, and access to cutting-edge communications technology like 5G and 6G. Can virtual communities replace physical ones? Do they engender democracy and equity, or replicate the inequalities of face-to-face communities and social relations? Only time would tell. There is need for a serious assessment of the ways in which justice, equality, equity, democracy, and competing ethical claims introduce complex human preferences, social choice, and institutions that distill them into policy in ways that strongly connect current practices and orthodoxies and past ideologies and cultural assumptions. Thus, historical context, dominant power, and culture have tremendous ideological power, which are often inadequately examined, but do shape human consciousness to influence what we accept as normal, good, decent, and their opposites. The hashtag EndSARS youth protesters were demanding full democracy in Nigeria. They made specific demands that, if taken seriously, would have put Nigeria on a good path toward achieving its aspirations as expressed in foundational documents like the Constitution, and also would have contributed to fulfilling the social contract between government and the people. That Nigeria belongs to all its citizens, that human security of all Nigerians matters, that citizens have a legitimate right to demand attention to their issues and problems, that government abuse of power and impunity are unacceptable, that agents of the state should not profile citizens and presume that they are guilty before being proven innocent, that they should not use violence and intimidation to terrorize citizens. The hashtag EndSARS protesters also were doing what the youths tend to do. They were being critical of the lapses and inadequacies of past generations. Some of their critiques were accurate, others were not. Finally, and to be specific, where they were not accurate is to say that the older generation, they are all Benudake. Finally, the protesters bring to mind Frantz Fanon's words in The Wretched of the Earth, the 1963 edition. And here is the quote: "Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity." The hashtag EndSAR's critique of the Benudake generation did not emerge from a vacuum. The youth drew on their lived experience to express their deep displeasure with the trajectory of Nigerian political, social, and economic systems. They distinguished themselves from the older generation, which was seen as responsible for and complicit in Nigeria's precipitous decline. They fought the good fight in speaking loudly about the injustices and human rights abuses that pervade the Nigerian political and social systems. So, wọn ò dákẹ́, kí tí wọ́n má bàa wọn dákẹ́. They were not silent so that their problems would not weigh on them, live with them, and remain unsolved. Fanon also said, we must rid ourselves of the habit, now that we are in the thick of the fight, of minimizing the action of our fathers or of feigning incomprehension when considering their silence and passivity. They fought as well as they could with the arms that they possessed then. And if the echoes of their struggle have not resounded in the international arena, we must realize that the reason for this silence lies less in their lack of heroism than in the fundamentally different international situation of our time. It needed more than one native, Fanon said, to say, we've had enough. More than one peasant rising crushed, more than one demonstration put down before we could today hold our own certain in our victory. Although he was speaking about the anti-colonial struggle in the nationalist era, Fanon puts my critique of the ahistoricity of the #EndSARS protests into context. The #EndSARS protesters were courageous and should be commended for speaking up and calling out the Nigerian state. However, the older generation of Nigerians cannot be categorized as Benudake in a blanket manner. There have been struggles in the past, but they happened at a different historical era, and today's strategies were not available. What they did opened up space for succeeding generations. Their silence is not necessarily indicative of timidity or complicity. Further, it is important that we remember our history so we can learn from it and not repeat mistakes of the past. It is important to honor the sacrifices of those on whose shoulders we stand while speaking truth to power. Thank you very much. We have now come to the end of this very long paper.